Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of you. A very warm welcome to today's event on Justice for Women and Girls, Galvanizing Action for an Equal Future. I'm Ilaria Bottigliero, the Director of Policy Research and Learning at IDLO. It will be my pleasure today to guide you through our event. I would like to thank all of you for connecting, and special thanks to our long-standing Justice for Women partners, UN Women, the World Bank, and the Pathfinders, with whom we have co-organized this event in the lead up to Generation Equality Forum, which is set to start tomorrow morning in Paris, France. Before we start our discussions for today, I would like to share with you a few housekeeping rules. Please be informed that the webinar will be recorded and broadcasted on Facebook Live. And the recording of the webinar will be available on IDLO's webinar and webpage following the end of this event. You will see on your right-hand side that the chat box is open. So the chat room will be enabled throughout the webinar. And I can already see that there is a great deal of exchange among participants. So thank you so much for keeping the chat alive and the discussion active. You will also be able to click the Q&A button. So attendees may use the Q&A window to ask questions. And please just remember that when asking a question, kindly type your country and organization before the question. My colleague at IDLO will monitor the Q&A window and direct the questions to the moderator, who will then pose the question directly to the panelists. We are expecting a significant amount of questions, so we apologize in advance for not being able, most likely, to answer all of your questions, but we will do our best. I would also like to share with you that interpretation is available and will be provided in English, French, and Spanish. So if you wish to listen to the webinar in a specific language, please click the interpretation button, which is located on your webinar controls. So let's move into the substance of our discussion today. The reason why IDLO, UN Women, the World Bank, and the Pathfinders are here today is because we are committed to justice for women, and we believe in its strong transformative power across Generation Equality's 6 action themes. In a moment, we will share with you 3 short videos where we will hear powerful and urgent calls to put justice for women at the core of generation equality and to eradicate the gender justice gaps that still persist across the 6 action coalition themes. Let's hear from Jen Beagle, the Director General of IDLO, Sandy Okoro, the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the World Bank Group, and Liv Torres, the Director of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies. Here are the videos.
Despite decades of conventions, declarations, and commitments, the gender justice gap remains wide, and the pandemic has made it much wider, putting women's lives and livelihoods at risk and threatening to leave them even further behind. As we recover and rebuild from COVID-19, we face stark choices about the kind of world we want to live in. We cannot sustain peace nor achieve sustainable development without the full and equal participation and leadership of women. Realizing the promise of generation equality will require bold thinking and concrete action. The law can be a powerful instrument to empower women and girls and ensure that their human rights have equal recognition and protection. IDLO is committed to working with our partners to build on the momentum of generation equality and help close the gender justice gap.
Justice for women is at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. It is also at the core of the World Bank Group's efforts to end poverty and boost shared prosperity for all. Justice for women means justice for all, and we firmly believe that no society can thrive without fully including women and girls in the equation. We saw how the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated gender gaps and reversed decades of gains for women in areas like human capital, economic empowerment, and voice and agency, and of course, education. But let us commit today to reverse course and multiply our efforts towards gender equality, and more specifically around access to justice. The solution starts in forums such as this one. And the World Bank supports generation equality in its goals to make transformative actions and achieve immediate and irreversible progress towards gender equality. The solution is in the hands of the many, not the few. So I call on all justice sectors actors to do their part and be part of the solution. Thank you.
It's high time that women's justice problems are taken seriously. Billions of women are struggling with violence, discrimination, and injustices. We need the justice sector to take this seriously. We need empowerment programs, we need the justice system to turn around, and we need women's organizations to mobilize more strongly. We thank the IDLO, UN Women, and the World Bank for partnership, and we now look forward to the Generation Equality Forum taking it forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen, Sandy, and Liv, for your powerful messages. So what a great introduction to our expert panel. Today, our speakers are inspiring change makers. They will share their insight on how to address persistent justice challenges for women and girls so that we can accelerate action across generation equality themes. For today's discussion, we selected 3 key issues for reflection. The first one has to do with challenges. We are going to explore the justice gaps that still persist across the 6 Generation Equality Action Coalition themes. In other words, what are the key areas where we are lagging behind in terms of laws, policies, jurisprudence, and access to justice? Our second question will be around priority actions. What commitments and concrete action on justice for women and girls should be prioritized from the various stakeholders? And the third final question is around collaborative solutions. What lessons or good practices are in place for collaborative engagement to prevent and resolve women's justice problems, especially those exacerbated by COVID-19? And to help us address these questions and guide the panelists, we are very fortunate today to have a special guest moderator with us, who's going to stimulate our thinking on justice for women. It is a real pleasure to introduce you to our moderator, Lisha Chi Santorelli, who is the world editor and senior journalist team manager of the BBC World Service Trust. Lisha has an impressive career working across television, radio, and digital outlets. We posted her bio on the chat, so feel free to take a look. And in the meantime, Lisha, over to you for the substantive discussion, with many, many thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Welcome everyone to this event. And because we have such a great panel and not much time, I want to get straight into the discussion. So we have a set of panelists from across the world. We have Ms. Oluwaseun Ayodeji Esowubi, Ms. Hadil Abdul Aziz, Executive Director, Justice Center for Legal Aid in Jordan, Attorney Lisa Masuhud Alamia, a member of the Bangsamoro Transition Authority in the Philippines, Ms. Enid Mathoni, Senior Vice President for the Global Legal Program at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and Dr. Omaira Bolaños, the Director of Latin America and Gender Justice Programs, Rights and Resources International. So we're going to kick it off starting with Oluwaseun. I want to basically ask you about your work on sexual and gender-based violence prevention and response. What have been some of the biggest legal challenges confronting women seeking justice for these crimes? And you are one of the most prominent youth advocates in Nigeria. And so in terms of your own personal experience, what have been some of the main challenges that you have encountered doing this really important work?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. I will just speak about a few of the issues that I've experienced in my work. The first is the corrupt nature of the justice system. And this goes from, the Nigerian police force, for instance, to the court itself. You have processes where the Nigerian police is requesting so that they're able to get a share of the resources. You also have court attendants try to frustrate it in the court processes. Another thing I want to talk about is witness intimidation. You have survivors and witnesses being intimidated by either the families of the perpetrator or even the families of the victims themselves. Because when it comes to issues of sexual and gender-based violence, it's still regarded as a social issue that should be managed within the family sector and not necessarily taken to court. So you have intimidation, you have threats to life as well. Some survivors are out and they don't, court. Another thing that is a challenge is a less. I've been in this space for 7, and the average number of years for each case I have worked on is about. And it's a tedious process where survivors have to come to court sometimes, or women in general have to come to court sometimes to testify. And if you look at their locations, they're mostly.
Oluwaseun, we appear to have some technical difficulties with your line. So I'm just going to jump in there because the last bit that I got was about how, when women go to court, it's very long, it's drawn out, and it basically reinforces the trauma that these women have gone through. But I do want to come back to you. Let me just move on quickly to Ms. Hadil and her work at the Justice Center for Legal Aid. So short form is the JCLA. You're the executive director there. It's the largest legal aid provider in Jordan. It's got 21 clinics across the country. Jordan has 12 governance, administrative divisions. Can you highlight the type of people who come seeking your services? And, and the same question, what type of challenges do these people seeking the services and the JCLA encounter when they are seeking justice? Ms. Hadil.
Thank you. We provide services. We are an access to justice organization, and we operate on a first come, first served model of provision of legal aid services and legal empowerment services to the public in general. Originally, we always identified ourselves as a justice organization. We never said we are focusing on women. The reality is that the vast majority of people we serve are women because they are more likely to need our services, to need protection. They are more likely to be eligible because they have less access to resources. The kind of services that are usually sought, you would be surprised that they are mostly very simple issues. Women need to have dignity in their daily lives. They are trying to create a dignified living for themselves and for their families, and they request the protection of the law. We handle a lot of GBV related issues, And we also operate, we have a criminal justice unit, because in Jordan we do not have a legal aid. Our national legal aid system is very limited, and it's only provides services for severe criminal cases, and that leaves a lot of people unprotected, and they have to defend themselves in a very complex system. So about the challenges, there are multiple layered, as you would imagine, challenges facing people in general, and women most, even more so. They are usually multi-sectional and multi-layered, in the sense that we have legal barriers that are challenging people and not allowing them to access justice, like high fees, like mandatory representation by lawyers, and then we have policies that are discriminatory against women or against the most vulnerable groups. And then we have, of course, the social barriers. We've heard it many times that, it is dishonorable for a woman to go to court to demand her rights. So, like every time women, if they had choice to give up, they would not be here. They would not seek the justice system. But most of them, they have no option. They need the protection of the law, and it's our job to provide it.
Thank you. And, your work in establishing a national legal literacy program and advocating for reforms is important steps to achieving that. So I want to continue going around our panel to establish what justice gaps persist across these 6 Generation Equality Action Coalition themes. And so next, let's go to Attorney Liza from the Philippines. The Bangsamoro Autonomous Region is really, really interesting. This was established following years of peace talks between the Philippine government and various groups there. And it is the only Muslim majority autonomous region in the Philippines with an interim regional government, the first of its kind in the country. So Liza, one of the Action Coalition themes for Generation Equality is feminist movements and leadership. And as one of the few female parliamentarians, members of parliament in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, we'd love to hear about what your experience in office has been and what some of the challenges that you've faced in your role has been, both personally and professionally.
Thank you, Lisha. Good afternoon and good evening. I'm trying to turn on my, okay. Yes, thank you, sorry. So thank you, that's a very good question, Lisha. So I'll focus on feminist movements and leadership. For context, as you have said, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region is a newly created region with an interim form of government. And within the region, a little more than half, around 50.2% of the total population is female. However, within our very own parliament, representing the people of the Bangsamoro, only 13 out of 80 seats are held by women. Just one woman for every 5 men in the parliament. And being one of these 13 women members is not easy. And even back in the time when I served as the first and the only woman executive secretary of the regional government, I have experienced being downplayed and dismissed, being excluded from political conversations and decision-making spaces. As I and my colleagues in the parliament would jokingly say, sometimes we have to raise our voices a little so that we can be heard. I also know, just to discuss further on the challenges, how hard it is to institute gender-responsive policies and to explain in a pool of men how integral these laws or provisions are. It's also difficult to argue and assert that the fight requires male involvement, and that this involvement does not just mean lip service and administrative compliance, but it should include meaningful reforms in both our formal and informal institutions. So despite being among the most active and vocal, women have always found themselves at the periphery of policy priorities and have struggled to gain a foothold in key decision-making spaces. So often our problems are dismissed as too narrow and specific, relegated to the sidelines in favor of the other more pressing concerns. In this way, our sectors, along with many others, has been subjected to incongruent standards and is said to hurdle many obstacles just to be taken seriously. And I'd like to believe that this is happening not just in our area, but also in other parts of the world.
I really want to hear about some of these issues that are pushed to the periphery that you work on that really needs policy support. You know, you work on issues ranging from female genital cutting, orphans, religious leadership, honor crimes and killings, and so forth. So we'll come back to that. So let's go to our next panelist to establish some of the challenges faced there. Enid Materney, Senior Vice President at the Global Legal Program Center for Reproductive Rights. In your work, what do you see as the main legal and justice challenges facing women and girls as they seek these rights?
Thank you, Lisha, for that important question. And I think my work would just build on to what the first two colleagues have talked about. At the center, we use the power of law to ensure that sexual reproductive health and rights are realized as fundamental rights globally. And just to mention that, I think one thing that people miss out is that sexual reproductive health and rights, which I might say SRHR at some point, is really a cornerstone for many other rights that women and girls need to realize other rights in their lives, including gender equality. And so I'll start talking about the challenges and first talk about the law itself as a challenge to women and girls accessing sexual reproductive health and services in three instances. The first one is that we are seeing, unfortunately, almost 30 years after a lot of progress has been done, almost a deliberate attempt to make laws and policies and sometimes in constitutional amendments in many countries that are actually seeking to reverse gains for women generally, but more specifically around gains on sexual reproductive health and rights. I'll give a couple of examples that we see as the center, and because this particular forum is about generational equality, I'll speak a bit about some of the challenges that girls and adolescents specifically face. And the first one is that we are seeing a concerning trend where there's actually laws in books that effectively criminalize adolescent consensual sex, and where we are seeing it's actually based on punitive rather than evidence-based and rights-based approach, which effectively signals to adolescents that engaging in consensual sex with another adolescent is not only bad, but is actually criminal. But the bigger problem of that is that it also causes problems for service providers, including judiciaries, when they're trying to deal with such matters, because then their hands are tied to deal with the matter as a criminal matter other than a social issue and a health issue. I'll also speak a little about the fact that we know in most countries across the world, we have laws and policies that ban comprehensive sexuality education. We, for example, as a center working in Latin America, we have many cases of girls who've been violated and who, because there's no way of them getting information, whether it's to services or even how to know when you're actually being violated or to report, that is a huge gap that would need to be addressed. And of course, the next question is about the fact that most of the laws that do exist explicitly deny adolescents the right to make decisions, to access information and services, in that they will require either parental or judicial authorization for those services under a certain age. And we know we have studies that demonstrate that when adolescents are required to receive such authorization for sexual and reproductive health services, they either opt not to go for the services, and they'll still engage in the sexual activity anyway, or they actually get the wrong information. And finally, just to mention that we've seen also in most places that there's politicization and criminalization or overregulation of sexual reproductive health services, unlike any other health service provision. And we know the impact of this in the long run is actually to deny women and girls autonomy to be able to access services, and it actually causes stigma and pushes the services further underground, further impacting especially the most marginalized, the most that face intersectional discrimination, like poor women, poor girls, migrant women, and other LGBTQ communities, amongst others. And I think I'll stop there, later to give other an opportunity.
I mean, it's really interesting to hear how many challenges there are, from increasingly hostile environments or authorities to getting unfriendly laws, to representation when it does come to policy making. Let's move on to our last but not least panelist on the Justice Challenge in Latin America. That's Dr. Omaira Bolaños. So she has 25 years of experience throughout Latin America working on indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant communities, collective tenure rights, sustainable development, and so forth. So feminist, Dr. Omaira, feminist action for climate justice is one of the action coalition pillars for generation equality. In your experience working in Latin America, what are some of the legal and justice challenges faced by women in relation to environmental rights and climate action?
Thank you. I will answer from the perspective of Latin America and the type of work that I do around securing tenure rights. And I will say that one of the major injustices faced by women, especially women from indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local community, is the historical gap in the legal recognition of their tenure rights. This lack of recognition and also implementation of the laws that has recognized their rights encompasses a huge legal justice gap faced by women in relation to environment rights and climate change goals. And this is critical, taking into account that around the world, indigenous peoples and local communities, up to 2 billion people that have historical rights and customarily manage about 50% of all lands in the world. But they only have legal recognition over the lands over 10% of those lands. So if we see the dimensions of the contribution of indigenous people, but the lack of recognition, only 10% of the land, and we see deep in terms of women's rights, we see major gaps, okay? Women's rights to substantially participate in decisions making, determine the use, management of the land, conservation, allocation of inheritance rights remains inadequately protected under national laws. As a result of this injustice, community level institutions, leadership roles, being part of high level positions tend to be heavily controlled by men. And national laws do not consistently protect women's rights to exercise the leadership rights in decision-making roles. And without legal recognition of their tenure rights and secure governance and leaderships, women face more limitations to benefit from gender justice climate actions, including access to finance and to get support. And this, across Latin America, women, indigenous women has made invaluable contributions to sustainable development and climate action goals. And they bear the primary responsibility for meeting communities and livelihoods needs for food, energy, traditional medicine, maintaining livelihoods. And although they are fulfilling this essential, their work is undervalued and most of the time invisible. So, and they doing this at the risk of personal safety and rates of threats, assaults, and murder of indigenous and local women that are defending their land rights, that are defending the environments. As many of you might have seen in global reports, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, Honduras, Peru are among the countries that experience major events of killing of community leaders, including women. So this violation of rights is exacerbated by the lack of recognition and protection of community and women's tenure rights. I will leave it there as a make a statement so we can continue this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Omaira. And you know, Indigenous people's rights, including all the issues that you touched upon, has increasingly come into the news headlines as well, increasing awareness around these issues, as well as the gaps which you pointed out. I'd really like to go back quickly to Ms. Oluwaseun, because we lost her a little bit earlier due to technical difficulties. So she cut off halfway while discussing some of the challenges in her work. But I also wanted to follow up on that, on what she was saying, because Oluwaseun, you've had so many awards for your recognizing the amazing work that you do. This includes the first ever 2020 Global Citizen Prize for Nigeria's Hero, the Commonwealth Young Person for the Year 2019, and so forth. And many of these awards are due to your work on gender-based violence. So can you also highlight some of the successful legal and justice initiatives that address gender-based violence in your country?
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry you couldn't hear me earlier. Can you see me properly and hear me clearly? Okay, great. We explored different strategies to get justice for women, and I'll just give you about 4 examples. The first is alternative dispute resolution. And what we do is we leverage conflict resolutions to sort out basic issue like, women's access to land, or women being able to claim ownership of their children if they separate from their partners. Another thing we do is we make access to representation very easy via a text, who then liaise to other legal stakeholder, they liaise with the client on their behalf. We also leverage technology. Recently, we partnered with a mobile app technology company to create an emergency response bot, where if I'm in an unsafe environment, all I have to click on is the panic button. It informs my loved ones, family and friends about where I am, and also collates data about what is ongoing there. Because what we've noticed is when we get to court, lack of evidence actually ruins a lot of cases. They are thrown out. So what this app does is it helps to collect that information that we can present in court. And then finally, we do a lot of work around policy reforms. We realize gaps in our legal system that protects the rights of women and girls. For instance, a victim of rape cannot access abortion, except as in the case of life and death. But this is quite sad because, girls are being raped by their brothers, by their fathers, and they are forced to keep those children. So what we're currently doing is working with different stakeholders and partners to review the laws that we have generally around women's safety and well-being, but also ensuring that access to justice is not just one issue, it's actually a very holistic approach that we're implementing. Thank you.
We actually have a question directly related to your work, but I'll get to that shortly, because I do want to hear some other examples of the solutions and some of the successful best practice that our panelists are employing to support their work. So let's go back to Ms. Hadil, because you talked about a number of challenges facing you in Jordan and your team there, including the fact that the people who come for legal aid go through a system where it's very long drawn out, it's very taxing on them. So can you talk about some of the good examples or best practice that has so far worked in your favor in the legal arena in Jordan?
In order to combat so many of the challenges that our beneficiaries face, and we as an organization face, we are very much involved in policy reform, capacity building for the stakeholders. So, for example, we did lots of training, trying to train the police on the rights of the detainees, and we have been successful in even identifying heroes or leaders within the police entity that are now currently trainers, and they are training and they have adopted the themes, and they are trying to get the messages out, and working within the system sometimes will get you quicker results in that area. But additionally, we've been trying to leverage technology. We operate 2 hotlines. One of them is a duty lawyer, where we actually respond to requests for representation at police stations, because in Jordan we do not the right to be represented at the police station or have access to counsel so early within the case is not guaranteed by the law. And we believe that this is a fundamental right that can lead to protection specifically from abuse and from torture and ill treatment at the police station, which would then lead to, it would be much more difficult to fix at a later stage if you have a confession, for example. So we operate a duty lawyer hotline where people will call, and we send out lawyers depending on their geographic location. And we also operate at a GBV related hotline where victims of abuse can call, and we provide services, and we do follow up, and we provide accompaniment services, not just the legal services. So we have lawyers who are doing representation and counseling. But one interesting and very effective service that is performed by paralegals, not lawyers, is we accompany victims or survivors to present their evidence, to present their to submit a complaint, because inherently I think that one of the most challenges or the barriers of women access protection services is that the patriarchy within the protection system itself. So if a woman is actually convinced that you don't need to break your home, you just, he did not mean to beat you so hard, he was just angry, or he had problems, financial problems, he loves you, you should go back. And we find that victims and survivors in many times they find themselves even more pressure to just waive their rights, and that, or not to continue the legal proceedings, which means that at a later stage they will not have the evidence they need. So being accompanied by a non-lawyer will guarantee that regardless of her decision, she makes an informed decision. This is what we aim to have. We also work by documenting the processes and challenges at the lowest level. We then document them in policy papers and have discussions around them with the management and the leadership within the justice sector, trying to create change from bottom up as well as top down approaches.
I like that, bottom up and top down as well. And really, really quickly before I move on, what should the role of the justice institutions be in ensuring that women have equal access to justice? Because you mentioned about women not needing the ability to know their legal rights, having the accompaniment at the station, and that hotline made such a difference. And Oluwaseun mentioned that in Nigeria, there are issues with the police as well when it comes to gender-based violence and justice. So what should the role of the justice institutions be, or how could they improve?
I think that holding the justice system accountable, like the justice authorities, they should be held accountable to be actively involved in identifying and solving the issues of discrimination within and inefficiency within their own system. It is not enough to have access to a justice system. Also, you need to ensure that you have access to a just justice system that is responsive and truly ensures that the most vulnerable people have the protection of the law.
Absolutely. Keyword being accountability. So Liza, one of the areas that you focus on has to do with civic spaces for women. And I'd really like you to expand in terms of what actions should be prioritized to enhance female or women's political participation, as well as to expand civic spaces. So if you could firstly touch on why these are so important, and then what we can do to expand these, that'll be fantastic.
Okay. Well, my answer would be based on the context where I come from, in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, in a majority-minority society in the Philippines. The commitment to expand the women and girls' access to justice should always take root in a collective recognition of their genuine needs. And this necessitates multi-stakeholder collaboration, requiring a whole of society approach. specifically for women's political and civic participation, I think we should prioritize the collaboration of different sectors in expanding civic spaces and women's participation in political processes. And so this ultimately necessitates platforms and a solid agenda, and which can vary across contexts. In our region, for example, we are working to legislate a women's caucus in the parliament. This is a new parliament, and we're trying to set up this women's caucus in recognition of the important role of women and their representation in decision-making and policy determining bodies of the Bangsamoro government. Aside from that, we're also working on integrating gender-responsive policies to our foundational laws, particularly in our transitional work towards a stronger electoral practice in the region. And this includes policies on gender inclusion in the formation of political parties, in preparation for the election. We're also right now pushing for the passage of the Gender and Development Code, which would include and encompass all of the issues that have been raised by our other esteemed speakers here. We are also drafting a regional action plan on women, peace, and security. Take note that we come from a post-conflict area, and we're looking at incorporating all of these international treatises and national laws like the Magna Carta for women in our own autonomous regional laws. And perhaps to build on the themes identified by the action coalitions, I think it is also worthwhile to emphasize the importance of transitional justice, especially in an area like ours, in a post-conflict society across the globe. Transitional justice, or TJ, well, these are measures and processes that are implemented to address the legacies of massive human rights abuses during the occurrence of wars or conflicts. And it has 4 pillars: criminal prosecution, truth-telling, reparations, institutional reforms, for example, guarantees of non-recurrence. So we have to remember also that aside from that issue, a lot of war-torn states or territories like our area are also disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 crisis. So you have these layers and layers of challenges. And with the shift of attention and resources, we tend to forget the justice needs of the human rights victims, especially the women and girls, and their importance to peace-building efforts. And so I believe this is vital to increase the access of the marginalized sectors like women war survivors, girl orphans, or women orphans or widows of war. We need to increase their access to justice. And the priority areas for this should include context-specific interventions such as reparation systems, alternative dispute resolution mentioned earlier, in the truth commissions, which would make sure that there are women who are part of the truth commissions, and that all of the members of the Truth Commission should at least be trained and skilled on gender sensitive responses and programs, and memorialization, among others. And so transitional justice responses to gender-based violations during conflict and authoritarian rule are essential for ensuring justice for justice for the victims, combating women's marginalization, and preventing future violations against women and other communities targeted for their gender. So I think it is necessary that there is a gendered analysis of justice, and we need to require a rethinking of the violations for which justice is sought. And finally, in addition to what I have said and the other speakers, I think redress cannot be limited to violations, but must encompass measures to address the underlying inequalities that have shaped the context of violations and their impact. So it is very important that we incorporate a gendered perspective in the design and implementation of transitional justice mechanisms in post-conflict contexts.
Yeah, Lisa, when you talk about gendered analysis, context-specific interventions, I'm just going, yes, absolutely. But implementing this in the real world lot challenging. I'm just conscious of time, and I do want to start getting to some of the questions. And I noticed that you did also touch on the COVID pandemic. It's worth mentioning that the COVID-19 pandemic has generally made gender equality and justice issues more challenging across the board, but I guess it also might have opportunities. So one of the areas that's come up in the questions has come from Kathleen Kaganan in the Philippines. And so Lisa, really quickly, her question is, gender stereotypes found in culture and society impact women's access to justice in many aspects, such as in rape and sexual harassment cases and in achieving equality when it comes to the law and family relations. What are some of the strategies that work to change these gender stereotypes, whether at the community or institutional level? Perhaps maybe you could even speak from your own personal experience there, but just a quick answer to that question from Kathleen.
Okay, just a quick answer. I think I'd like to focus on COVID-19 plus the question. We have seen the positive impact from the people's increased access to digital platforms because of COVID-19. For example, in the Philippines, we witnessed a peak of online protests that call out abusers and seek the attention of concerned institutions and empower the voices of survivors. This trend was driven by empowered young people who find a safe place on social media platforms. And so several women's groups have jumped in, initiating dialogues about how they can help and encourage help-seeking behavior among GBV survivors. Also, we have made use of multi-sectoral cooperation in the campaign to end child marriages in our region. While our National Congress is working in finalizing national policies to criminalize child marriage, for example, we at the regional level, government agencies, international NGOs, and local CSOs have come together to build a solid support base for the policies, from data gathering, building of databases, the rallies and webinars that we have been conducting, to technical resources and knowledge production. And finally, in the judiciary, our Supreme Court is also adapting as it works to digitize services in over 2,600 courts nationwide. And so it has activated its young, yet getting by electronic systems, and has partnered with Microsoft in creating the portal Philippine Judiciary 365. You can look for it in Google for it, which has a video conference and email features for virtual hearings, tracking of cases, etc. And this has opened, has given a platform for women who are victims of gender-based violence to come forward. And many of the lower courts are following suit. And with the help of the private sector and national programs, plus civil society organizations that work on these issues, more and more women are now coming out and asking for help from either free legal aid agencies or government agencies that provide services to women victims of gender-based violence.
Lisa, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to Enid, because in terms of the questions that are coming in, I'd like to pose one to you around law enforcement, where Mirko Fernandez is asking, could you elaborate where the police have owned the skills and awareness that has led or is leading change in behavior? Have you encountered that, firstly? And another question is that from Christina Elizabeth Valencia Araujo, apologies if I pronounced that wrong, from Ecuador. She asked that not all of the rape cases need to be judicialized in order to not reinforce the victim's trauma. If so, how can we deter the commitment of these crimes, and also how to provide the victims justice? So two very different questions there, Enid, but the first is that, you know, you work with around law enforcement. I think we mentioned that in a pre-interview chat. So in terms of the rule of law being used to address challenges, have you encountered good practices and recommendations that should be prioritized? And are you able to also take on that second question as well about the taking of such cases to the judicial system from Christina Elizabeth? That question there.
Thank you, Leisha. I will stick to the first one. I'm not very sure I got the second one. Is the question that we shouldn't be taking them, or that we should use other forums, or that we should take them to the system? But I can speak to the first one first.
Yeah, let's go with the first one first.
Yeah, so I'll talk, one of the things that the center does as part of dealing with the challenges that I talked about in terms of laws that exist not being implemented, and sometimes you see, because of the gaps in the laws or misinterpretation or misrepresentation of the provisions, especially around the more stigmatized services like providing services to adolescents or abortion services, or cases where there's obstetric malpractices. I think the bigger challenge is always that a lot of times the supply side, which is the government agencies, a lot of times would either because they're not informed or because of pressure, they actually would be the ones who are either not supporting or violating or forcing stigma for the service providers. So I'll give an example. One of the things that we do as the center is that we identify champions within government agencies, the supply side, and we actually work with them, because a lot of times we realize that it's because of sometimes lack of information or sometimes cultural interpretations. And we've actually found in cases where you take the time to work with local partners, build capacities of police, explain to them the human rights framework around why women and girls should get these services as of right and not as a privilege. Explain why that they do have an obligation to protect these women and girls. In fact, we've seen not just the police, but judicial officers, we've seen workers in ministries of health, we've seen workers in other ministries as well, actually coming up and being our partners in actually impacting change. So I think what I would say is that we usually do identify at the center when we're working with different government agencies to see why are they not protecting or providing services. Is it because of inability, in which case maybe it means they don't have the skills, or they don't understand the law, or they don't understand the processes, in which case we build their capacities to be able to then understand what their obligation is. Sometimes we help them interpret the law when the law is not clear. Like, for example, a lot of them will say, abortion is illegal, but in most countries, there's always, even in the most restrictive one, there's always an exception. So we explain the law to them, and they're able to then support provision of services. But there's also the instances where, for example, we actually realize it's that they are refusing to act. So it's not that they don't know, it's because for different reasons, they are refusing to act. So in cases like that, we go to court, because at the end of the day, governments and also if you're an agent of the government, you have an obligation to be able to implement laws that countries have signed on to. So in cases where they are refusing to act, we go to court either through impact litigation with our partners on the ground, or sometimes we'll do advocacy or support our partners to do advocacy to make sure that the governments are held. And when I say government, it includes police, courts and others. They're held accountable to provide those services to women.
Thank you, Enid. Dr. Omaira, I want to ask you the same question from Mirko Fernandez, which is, can you elaborate on specific projects that you've engaged with law enforcement, where the police have own skills and awareness that has led or is leading change in their behavior? And second to that, how can we use law and justice tools to ensure that there is justice for women in climate action?
Thank you. I will say first that currently we are at the global level with major commitments towards climate action and conservation. And these goals cannot be met without clear actions at the international and national level in the recognition of tenure rights for indigenous Afro-descendant women and proper implementation of those laws. Now, without enforcing and creating the mechanism, the institution, the technical and human capacity, and building the capacity of grassroots organizations and women, we're not going to be able to meet goals for the benefit of communities and for the benefit of all of us that depend on those resources. What we had done in terms of, I want to give you one general example that doesn't go directly to the legal process, but that shows how we need to start looking in terms of economic, political justice for women, in terms of and be able to support that. As women has been one of the most economically marginalized in general. So we have a study and started implementing a study across Latin America, in 8 countries in Latin America, to understand how women from these communities, indigenous, Afro-descendant, or other local communities, are engaging in the economy from their own perspectives, from basis. What we found is the following, that is very interesting. We map around 89 initiatives that are led by women. And we found that they are working in a very different types of initiatives that are related to gastronomy, communication, textile, music, health, traditional medicines, ethnic beauty, languages, etc., etc. And then, even though 92% of those were formal enterprises, none of them has received support from the governments, philanthropic, and other international donors to start those economic initiatives. So all of them were promoted based on personal and community level needs to get out of poverty, to get out of gender violence, to get out of state violence or other actors that are invading their territories and resources. So in that sense, one of the things three things that we are trying to promote at the global level and the national level is that we need to provide financial support to grassroots organizations and women's organizations to enable them to advance the recognition of the land tenure rights, and how we link in the national policy, in the procedures for implementing national policy, categorically defining the rights of women and how to implement them in the operationalization of recognition and titling collective lands for communities. Second, we need to provide adequate support to lower and middle income governments to implement their pro-community or women's and girls legislation that secure their rights. We need to be able to inform the international architecture of funding, how those funding need to be channeled and allocated at the national level to the different actors that need to be presented in that. This is very important, especially in this moment, as you are talking about the impacts of COVID. I wanted to give some information. So as we know, COVID not only exacerbated issues of health, but revealed the systemic discrimination and inequality that exist in different societies. Latin America is one of the most unequal regions in the world. So in relation to indigenous peoples and local community women, the exacerbation of these factors increased by the presence of the pandemic. Data from the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil is one national indigenous organization in Brazil, reported that in December of last year, 2020, the mortality rate among indigenous people was 16% higher than among non-indigenous Brazilians. Okay, and they had lost elderly people. For indigenous people, the value of the elders by being the holders of the traditional knowledge and the one that transpassed to the new generation, including women, has been a huge loss in the process of maintaining culture and survival across decades. And also during the pandemic, there was a lack of protection of these communities from the state. So during the pandemic, even indigenous people took measures to self-lockdown to protect their territories and their families. Major events of invasions to their territories occur. And many intents from different governments in Brazil, Colombia, Peru, etc., others, were trying to pass new legislations that violated the rights of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent, deciding on projects that affect their rights. So in that regards, what we did during the pandemic, one of the major issues that were important is the pandemic put us in a virtual world. So we needed to become virtual. Connection to internet, Zoom capacity, all that indigenous people didn't have. So one of the things that we did and continue doing is to enabling indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other women's groups to have access, licenses to Zoom, connection to internet, phone capacity, because there became instant and critical tools to continue fighting for their rights and protecting their rights. Now, this is a factor that we need to take into account. So in actions forward, we need to enabling women, especially to know technology, to increase their capacity in technology and their organizations to be able to access and to use it in a way to maintain the connections with the different parts. So that is also one of the calls that we would like to do to international funding and securing funding to ensure that women at the community level had access to technology and build their capacity to use it. It's critical at this moment.
Dr. Omaira, it really sounds that the pandemic has hit Indigenous communities incredibly hard, as you laid out. I wasn't aware about a lot of the issues that you mentioned, but that similar to what Lisa said, the increased digitization during COVID has also allowed transformative opportunities for women and the causes that they fight for and their rights. So there are quite a few questions coming in, so I would like to start getting into the heart of these. So I'm going to kick off with Elsie Fedhas from Uganda. She works at the Palm Corps, which are promoters of agriculture and market linkages. So she's asking, do any of the panelists have examples of how they have worked to bridge the gap on law and implementation, especially on violence against adolescent girls? This is especially in extenuating cases during COVID-19, when many judiciary cases are not seeing the same attention as before the pandemic. That's a really great point about the impact on the judiciary during COVID, similar to the healthcare system. Certain cases were backlogged or put on the shelf. So out of the panelists, Oluwaseun, do you want to take this one on, or anyone feel free to jump in terms of bridging the gap on law and implementation, especially when it comes to violence against adolescent girls?
Great, I'll take that on. So in Nigeria, we didn't have a national law that protects the rights of women and girls, whether above 18 or adolescents. And so it took 13 years actually to advocate for the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, which has now been signed into law. But unfortunately, Nigeria operates a federal system where when a law is passed at the federal level, you also need to advocate with the state level to adopt it. So one of the things that we did was to work with the state houses of assembly to help them understand the importance of the bill, why it protects women, although they had reservations around why should a woman, get access to justice if beaten by the husband, because according to the Northern Part, the Sharia law permits that women can be beaten as a corrective measure, beat them but with love, which doesn't make any sense. So there was a lot of pushback from the National Assembly, but what we did was we, sat with them to explain why this law had to be passed and why it is important to protect women's rights. But unfortunately, during COVID, there was so much we couldn't do, right? Because COVID response in Nigeria did not have a gender-centric approach. Sexual violence response was not included as part of, COVID-19 response. We were struggling to even move. We were struggling to get the courts to hear our cases because our courts are not digitalized as at that time. So we had cases piling up. And I don't want to tell you what isn't real. I think what that situation showed us was we can actually, improve our systems. And towards the end of the lockdown in Nigeria, so many courts started picking up and we're having sessions virtually, which even made it much easier for survivors to access justice. Because one thing I noticed during the course of my work is the time survivors have to take out of work to be present in court, right, even limits their interest in accessing justice. So I would say that, you know, as times are going, as we're getting into the digital space, more courts in Nigeria and Africa are leveraging technology, which sometimes still limits, you know, people in the grassroots, because not every woman in the grassroots can access the internet. So it's basically thinking about how can we get justice so accessible that a woman in the, you know, remote area can easily access it. And to wrap up, I'd say that, you know, in terms of laws for adolescents, I think what has worked for us is having a law that addresses all persons, because I realized that government doesn't necessarily pass laws when women are at the center of it, but when it's addressed at all persons, you know, women, adolescents, boys, and men in general, they seem to, you know, pass it faster. And that's one area we've noticed in Nigeria and we're currently using. So that's really how we've gotten our law passed, and it addresses both adolescents, women, boys, you know, anyone at all. So far as a person has experienced social injustice or human rights abuse, they can get support under that law.
And I just want to ask you quickly the same question from Kathleen in the Philippines about what are some strategies that have worked when you're dealing at the community level and the institutional level. She was asking about the gender stereotypes found in culture and society and how that impacts women's access to justice in many aspects, such as rape and sexual harassment.
We do a lot of community dialogues and also, you know, knowledge building for gatekeepers in those communities. Same for institutions. Before you engage policymakers on the law, you have to, you know, build their capacity on what the law says, help them understand the value and the importance of that law for women's rights and safety. And that's one, you know, one area or strategy that we've used over time that has worked. We make them collaborators, right? They see themselves as doing something valuable in community. So when we engage a community, for instance, you know, we tell them about, if you can change this, you know, rural policy, or you change this system, this is the impact it have on women, and this is how you'll be seen in society. And everybody wants to do good, right? Every community member wants to be seen as progressive, as, you know, empowering women, quote unquote. And so when we go to those communities with that ideology, they seem to take it in. It's more of a collaboration as against a struggle. But I know that as we go forward, we do need to get to a place where, you know, we still need allies, but we have to be very clear, whether men go with us or not, the issues of women must be at the forefront, and, you know, it has to be either adopted or implemented. But as of now, the political structure we have is to get allies on board, make them feel important enough to push those policies, or to push the reviews at the community levels and implement them with the women. So that's what we do, and that's how we achieve our results.
And that's much harder than it sounds, you know, getting that buy-in from patriarchal societies and structures. But the allyship and building coalitions is so important. There's a question here for Lisa from Rebecca Shute, which I think actually, you know, applies to all of our panelists, given how high profile they are in their countries and globally for their work. So the question is, how do you combat or address the disproportionate targeting of women in politics for hate speech, online bullying, and libelous disinformation campaigns?
Thank you, Alicia. That's a very good question, Rebecca. I think first we have to understand the nature of the kind of online abuse against politicians. And it's often misunderstood as inevitable. If you're a politician, then please expect that you're going to be bullied anywhere, not just online, also in the mainstream media. After all, most of the public figures occasionally find ourselves on the receiving end of vitriolic attacks. Yet, over the past several years, we have noticed the gendered and racialized nature of the phenomenon has received increasing policy attention, because it appears that women are disproportionately targeted by online abuse and disinformation attacks. And this tends to be even more pronounced for female political leaders coming from racial, ethnic, religious, or other minority groups, for those who are highly visible in the media, for example, or those who speak out on feminist issues. And so it's very important that this is not just we should not just make the government accountable by making sure that there are laws that are available. For example, in the Philippines, we have the anti-cybercrime law. And so this is accessible to anyone, especially women politicians, if they'd like to file cases against those who commit online bullying against them. But there is also another way of doing this. We can ask the social media companies to become arbiters of online speech and be more accountable and responsible. But not only that, I think we should, instead of absolutely focusing on the social media companies, I think they should advance broader regulatory frameworks that would require platforms to become more transparent about their moderation practices, and also the kind of decision making that they do on the algorithms of their social their platforms, as well as ensuring compliance by independent monitoring and accountability mechanisms. And on top of that, governments have an important role to play in supporting civil society advocacy, research, and public education on gendered and racialized patterns of online abuse, including against political figures. So what we can do is that I think governments need to take action beyond just passing and enforcing all of these platform regulations, the anti-cybercrime law, or other platform regulations. For example, they can promote digital citizenship education in school curricula to make sure that our youth, the teenagers and young adults, would develop the skills to recognize and report inappropriate online conduct and help communicate this kind of messaging to everyone, and make sure that people would communicate respectfully online. And so there are other ways of also trying to of stopping this, or combating or addressing this disproportionate targeting of women. And mainly, I think I would just like to point out that we have to make sure that these social media companies would have greater transparency on their current content moderation capacity, because this will enable governments and civil society to better identify the shortcomings and push for targeted resource investments. Thank you.
Lisa, really strong recommendations there about multi-pronged approach, from stronger regulatory frameworks to education and so forth, because we know that the abuse and targeted harassment has increased. So I want to go to Hadil next. We have a question from Wafas Ofosu Ama. The question is, the justice system in most countries consists of a wide range of justice sector professionals: judges, magistrates, lawyers, police, social welfare workers, etc. Each of these professionals are key and need special training throughout their careers on gender-based violence. There can be no one-size-fits-all training except at the basic level. What are some good practices of targeted and appropriate training for these professionals?
I think that I do agree that there's no one size fit all. But in essence, we need two things. The first one is we need a basic training that not just ensures they have the proper knowledge and skills, because these are easier to acquire. What we find challenging is the attitudes and the demeanor and the convictions, when inherent discrimination and institutional violence can only be combated by changing the culture, the institutional culture. So we have two levels of changing the culture, not just the society, but also even within the institutions. And we have patriarchy that's very much inherently embedded within the justice institutions. And that's number one. We need to work on those basics. And then at the level of skills, I think that and knowledges, we definitely should not be just shooting in the dark, in the sense that we need to identify the needs. We need assessments of and identifying gaps. And it has to be another thing that need to be considered is it must be multi-leveled, in the sense of we need to engage, to have the voice of the people in identifying the challenges and the issues. And I think, again, Alicia, perhaps there's something that I would like to enhance here and to stress. Whatever we're aiming to do, like it's a really huge mandate in order to ensure women's access and all the vulnerable people's access to justice. There are many areas that need to be informed and reformed, whether we're talking about legal literacy issues, whether encouraging and empowering people to really challenge their economic and social barriers in order to come up and speak up and demand their rights, whether it's to address lack of resources or lack of or discrimination and that is so infiltrated within the justice system. The only one common thing that can help identify, provide data, and propose effective and efficient solution is civil society and women feminist groups and women empowerment agencies. If we invest in protecting the civic space and ensuring that these organizations have, and those champions have what they need to survive and to continue to be that link between the grassroots and the institutions at the highest level, if this is where we need to make an investment.
Yeah.
And there's no one answer on how we can train. However, all we can do is we need to make sure that training is an investment. So any training that just like brings in whatever organization or public entity goes to a 5-star hotel to have a workshop, we should really think of why we're doing what we're doing and what impact do we hope to achieve.
Expansion of civic spaces, and also that training is not the silver bullet. It's just one part of a broader piece of work. So I'm very conscious that we're running out of time, and I just want to squeeze in 2 more questions from our audience. The first is for Dr. Omaira. In Latin America, which country has a legal system that offers good protection for women, and why?
Thank you. So I'm gonna give some information. We did a study at the global level at 30 countries. Among them, 9 from Latin America, analyzing legal frameworks that recognize tenure rights and to see how, in the recognition of tenure rights, the rights of women to access and own property was defined. In general, we found something for all 3 regions, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, is that none of the countries comply with the international standard to comply with the UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discriminations Against Women, CEDAW, even though all the countries have signed and adhere to the convention. For the Latin America case, in general, Latin America provide a protection for women's inheritance rights. That means women can have access, is the most common, to access land to inheritance rights. However, in Latin America lag behind in regards to Africa and Asia in comparison in recognition of women's property rights in overarching law. So there are no categorical definitions. Only 4 countries of the 9 countries studied define in their laws that women has rights to own land. Also, Latin America lag behind in recognizing women's community level dispute resolutions and how to address conflicts, and also in recognizing women's community level leadership rights. And as you know, leadership rights is one of the most important rights to recognize to women at the community level to ensure their participation in decision-making in all processes that affect them at the household level or community levels. However, in Latin America, norms at the national and local level do recognize women's membership to the communities. And that is a small step in terms of recognizing their leadership rights. And what were the countries that we studied? So we did an analysis of Mexico, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. But in general, this is what we found in terms of there is still a lot to do. Latin America has a lot of policy reform on land tenure, but very little has advanced in terms of how those land tenure are categorically recognizing the rights of women to land. Thank you.
Dr. Amira, thank you very much for answering that question. I am conscious that we have actually just hit time on our event. We have, so much more questions that I wish we could get to, including some from Kenya and Uganda and so forth. Hopefully we'll collate these questions, or the speakers have seen some of these questions and can follow up. But I'd just like to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists today for their fantastic insights, for the work that they do. Oluwaseun, Executive Director, Stand to End Rape Initiative in Nigeria, Hadil Abdul Aziz for the Justice Center for Legal Aid in Jordan, Lisa in the Philippines, member of the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, and Dr. Omaira Bolaños, Director of the Latin America and Gender Justice Programs at Rights and Resource Initiative. And last but not least, I wish I had time to come to you at the very end, Enid, but we've just run out of time. So my apologies there. Enid Bethoni, who leads the Global Legal Program at the Center for Reproductive Rights as the Senior Vice President overseeing its 4 regional programs. We had so much more to cover. We knew that we were going to be short on time, but I want to say thank you to our audience for all of the questions that you sent in, all of them really important, very pertinent to our discussion. Please take down our names, get in touch, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Lisa. And I feel terrible breaking up this discussion because it was so great and so many great issue and a lot to say and such an inspirational discussion, really. To me, it is clear that there is so much to be done to close the gender justice gap. However, our discussion also shows very clearly that there is strong commitment on the part of so many dedicated women to achieve gender equality and ensure the realization of basic rights for women and girls through better laws, policies, and more effective justice system institutions. And this is really encouraging. So we are really happy to hear from you that your stories, your challenges, of course, but your very inspiring stories. Now, before concluding, I am really pleased to share with you another unique moment of this event, which is a special pre-release preview of the Elders short film on access to justice for women, which will be officially released tomorrow, 30 June, as part of the Generation Equalities Forum virtual village. So the film is embargoed until tomorrow, but the elders have really kindly shared it with us so that we can hear Mary Robinson, Graça Machel, and Hina Gilani make a strong call for access to justice for women as an important human right, but also as a critical enabler of other human rights. So let's watch together the short movie.
This is a message for all women everywhere. And men, we need you too.
COVID-19 has dramatically exacerbated inequalities.
It has threatened to halt or even reverse the gains of decades of collective action.
We must not let this happen.
We must not rebuild the status quo.
The elders are calling for a new approach, one that prioritizes access to justice and gender equality.
We call for the full participation of women in the justice sector, and we must see more women in leadership positions.
We urge leaders to increase funding for legal empowerment and justice services that meet the needs and lived experiences of women and girls.
A better world has to mean ending violence against women and girls.
Justice services for survivors of gender-based violence must be regarded as essential by governments. And when we are talking about ending violence against women, it is critical to acknowledge the role men can and must play.
Men, in particular men in roles of influence and power, need to speak out on violence against women and girls and defy the stereotypes that normalize and perpetuate gender inequality.
And to build a better world, we need quality data.
When women are not counted in the data, it's easy to disregard their needs.
So this year at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris and beyond,
And in all rooms, conference halls, and online meetings where decisions are made.
We stand in solidarity with all who call for this generation to be the generation that brings about equality.
and we champion access to justice for women and girls
as a critical component in building a better world for us all.
So with this powerful message, it is time to close our event for today. At IDLO, we are 100% committed to supporting generation equality, and we have issued a series of concrete justice and rule of law commitments across the various action themes, which will be released during the Paris Forum over the next 2 days. So we really look forward to working together with our partners to implementing them. And in the meantime, also on behalf of our co-organizers, UN Women, the World Bank, and the Pathfinders, it is time for me to thank our panelists, our guest moderator, Lisha Chi Santorelli, and especially all of you who have followed our discussion today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.